Hey, this is Paul Solt from Super Easy Apps. Welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you how to get started with auto layout. So this is a quick overview of auto layout, things that you can apply. I just published a 30 best practices on auto layout guide, and I want to go over about 10 to 15 of them right now in this video and get you started. I do have an upcoming course on auto layout that's going to be coming out in the near future, and that will go more in depth. But I just want to give you a run through if you've been reading some of the blog posts and you want to understand some of the core concepts. So let's jump right in and talk about it. So the first thing is design for iPhone 8. That's really important. That's how I start my apps. I've worked on Brew Coffee, and when I'm working on something like this, starting with the iPhone 8 design makes it easiest to get something working. In the past, we had, I won't even go into it, but the auto layout has been a little bit confusing. And so in order to make this easier and more approachable, just start with iPhone 8. It's that easy. So you're going to design an interface, and I have Sketch open here. This is the vector-based graphics tool that I use. I don't use Photoshop or Illustrator as much anymore because this is a lot more intuitive. There's way less controls, and it's a lot easier to get the results that I need. So I've got these different graphical elements that I've sort of laid out on the screen. The position is really important. So you want to sort of fit everything in where you want it. Once you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to mark it up, or you're just going to reference it when you're working in Xcode. I find it helpful to mark it up. I use some tool. There's a plugin I used. It was called Sketch Measure. I believe it's a free plugin that you can get for Sketch. I use that to just insert these, which allowed me then to create a layout design that I could export. So it's really nice in this tool, Sketch, to export graphics. So I can just export a graphic and now it's all marked up. And this is really helpful for developers so they know the spacing. And this is why we want to start with iPhone 8, because once you have the spacing down, then it's easier to apply these auto layout constraints in the actual application. You're going to also want to know the fonts, the colors that are used, the font sizes, and any of the specifics about those fonts. So I've got all that marked up. I'm going to just move this back over. So once we've got that set up, I'm just going to slide this right down here. You're going to go into your Xcode project, and I've got this open. It's minimized. Bring this to the top. So I'm going to do the auto layout and design in Xcode for the iPhone 8. So if you choose your different size classes, there's this little tab here. Make sure that you're on iPhone 8, not any of the other ones. We do want to test auto layout with the iPhone 8 Plus on the X and the SE. But to get started, it's easiest just to do design at the iPhone 8. You're going to match the design that you have over here, work through, drag the elements on. There's this media thing where we can drag any images. So I've already dragged a lot of the tip callouts, but you can just drag new ones on and place them wherever you need to do. I'll just delete that with the delete key. The next thing is, once you're ready to start laying out the interface and making changes, it's easy to mess something up. And so I want to just be straight up, like if you move things around like this, let's just throw things around, just undo with Command Z. You can just do Command Z, put everything back to where it needs to go. Most of the time you can just do one undo. If you're using something like stack views, you might have to do multiple undos. The next thing I want to talk about is sort of the relative and centered layouts. So these elements are going to be relative to each other. We'll set up the position of this element, and it's going to be in relation to the vertical positions of the things above and below it, but it's really dictating the center position for the control. And these are going to end up being sort of relative to that center one, especially something like this. This is sort of an extra detail ornament on our UI design. This position is always going to be underneath this element. So when we move this object around our screen, we're going to move it as a unit. We're not going to move it like this. They're always going to move together. So with auto layout, we can describe these rules to keep things aligned correctly. And so that's what we're going to do as we're adding these constraints. So I'm just going to undo those changes with Command Z. So that's sort of relative layouts. Now, if I want to center layouts, this is easy to center. This is not as easy to center. I want to center this in this space in this top region. And if I were to look at something like the iPhone X, I also have to keep in mind the safe area. So I really want to center this along the top. And in order to do that, we actually need to go back to our object editor and we need to pull out new views, and that's this little double square. So we've got the UI view. You drag one of these out and you can just place it anywhere. Now, when I'm working with views, it's good to zoom in, and we can't see everything. So I'm going to hide some panels so that we can see our zoom controls, or I can use my trackpad to zoom in. We want to make sure that this is the right height. So we're just going to sort of align this, and I zoomed in so I could see that detail, or you can use these buttons as well. So I want this right above that top graphic. I don't want it up higher. I want it right there. And I think I accidentally moved it, so I'm just going to undo that one change. The next thing I'll do is I'll make sure that I change background colors. This is really important. I sometimes pick some vibrant looking colors. This is going to show us the extent. Now, what I want to show you is when we run this on an iPhone 8, it's going to look great. But when we try to run it on an iPhone 8 Plus, that's where we'll notice that there are differences in the way this UI is laid out. Let me just pull open one of these simulators. So you can see that it fits great. Now, if I do the same thing with the iPhone 8 Plus, I'm just going to switch the simulator in this top bar. We are going to see that it's going to look a little different. So the layout that we have described, once you're designing it in Xcode, it doesn't have any rules on how it needs to sort of resize. And so now we have to describe those resize rules. That's what auto layout's all about. On the iPhone 8 Plus, we're going to see there's a lot of open space on the sides and the top and the bottom. And so in order to clean that up, what we need to do is describe the rules. And so I like to work and identify the region. So this is a region. I would say these are going to all be sort of a vertical region. We're going to go from these elements to these elements to this, and to pin to the bottom. So you want to think in terms of edges and tops and bottoms and sort of the big things. Something like this is an inner component. This is going to be centered within whatever this graphic is. So this is not going to really affect the overall structure. It's more of a supporting role. But this, we're going to just sort of line up in a vertical direction. So what I'll do, we can't see the graphic because I've got this view on top, but that's fine. I'm going to rename this view. We're going to call this top view. I'll just click on it. This is going to be super helpful for us moving forward, and we can just drag this to the top. Now, views are actually in reverse order, so this is actually the bottommost view, and now that's why this is visible again. This is the topmost view at the bottom. We can use the right click and drag with a diagonal drag to add constraints. These are how we add rules. So this, in order to add the rules, we actually need to drag over to the containing view. This is our super view. This is going to hold, that's the whole screen that we can see right now. We're going to just drag to that, and let me just zoom back out so we can see the whole device. Hide this bottom panel. So I need to drag this over, and it's hard to get to this. So if you don't see the screen on the left, make sure you click on this button. This is the document outline. It is not always visible, so we need to drag from this to this. This allows us to set up rules for how this is going to be pinned. And we want the leading edge, the trailing edge, and the top edge. So we're going to go ahead and set those up. And we're going to go, all of these are going to be the new safe area, which is going to make this work great on the iPhone X. We're going to click the Add Constraints button. That's going to give us the sort of vertical extent. Now, I'm just going to add a height. I'm going to right-click and drag this. Sorry, I want to say south, but I want to drag it down. And that's going to give us a height. So now we've got blue. So colors are really important here. What we're going to want to do, and actually, I've got some coloring going on with my computer, so I'm going to fix that real quick because I've got night shift on. Let's turn that off. Oh, these colors were looking super funky to me. Didn't even realize that. All right, so we are going to go through, and we've got this connection, and so we can see the blue lines. This means that we've got good layout. So if I run this again, we're going to see that this structural region is going to fill the extent on the iPhone 8 Plus, and that's exactly what we want it to do. The next thing is to finish setting up the structure, where we're going to set up the spacing to take advantage of the vertical space. And just to show you, we want to center content. So since I've got this top one right now described, I can go ahead and drag diagonally, and I can add both a center vertical and center horizontally. Now I'm holding the Shift key in order to add these constraints in one go rather than doing them multiple times. This is going to show me that the frame is different. So anytime you see these orange lines, they're going to show you that the frame is not what it expects. If that's the case, you can just hit the update frames button and that will snap it back to where it thinks it should go. But if you want this to really be centered, we want to move it here. And so clicking this button is going to snap it back. I don't want that. So I'm going to undo that. I want to actually update the constraint constants. I know this is a little bit of a mouthful, but that's going to reposition it. So now if I were to run it, it's going to work. Now, while that's going, I'm going to start adding these vertical constraints and laying this out. So I added this one constraint for the height. I don't want that anymore, so I'm just going to select that and delete it. You can just delete things. And the height of this is going to be dependent on sort of the extra space on the different iPhones. So it's going to shrink or resize itself. So I just need to connect this to each element in a vertical arrangement going down. So we're going to connect 1 to 1, and I'm just going to keep on going for the vertical spacing. Now I'm just doing this for the structural regions, not the sort of extra labels that are in the interiors. And auto layout's a little bit funky because if we don't specify all the rules, we're going to see a lot of red. And that means we have ambiguous layout, or we have misaligned views, or that we're missing constraints. And so it's not until I get to this last one, and I need to pin it to the bottom, but to pin it to the bottom, I have to drag over to the view. Once we do that, we can set up the bottom space to the safe area. Now, if we reselect everything, we're going to see that there are blue lines in the vertical directions, but there are red lines in the horizontal direction. So not everything is laid out. If there are no constraints on something like this one, you're going to see blue lines because it's just going to stay in place. If I run this again, we should see this has now changed. We're going to see it's going to be funky, but we're going to see the vertical spacing is correct. So we're centered. We've got the vertical spacing here. We've got the 15% underneath. Notice how it's not centered correctly, but that's okay. This label we haven't modified, but this is in the correct vertical position. This is in the correct vertical position as well as this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add more constraints. And I'm going to hold Shift to add multiple ones at the same time. And so it wants to move this. So if I want to move it, I can move it. I can see maybe I bumped it and it's not in the right proper position. So I can ask it to try and update its constraint. But I might want to hold off on that. I want to make sure that I've specified this to center, and I haven't done that yet. So that's the problem here. So we need the center horizontally. So it's a little bit tough at times to know if everything's laid out correctly, but these two are sort of relative to that one. And now I'm going to show you the preview. So the preview is going to be a way where we can actually test out these settings without having to run the iPhone that's right below me every time to sort of check these layout changes. And so I'm going to switch over into our assistant editor on the top, and the preview will allow me to then look at the iPhone 8 Plus. I'll go ahead and add that, and it's going to be off to the side here, and I'll see if I can zoom out a little bit. So this is going to help guide me as I am setting up the layout constraints. I'm just going to look, and it's not necessarily going to match what we see when we run it. So if I run it right now, you should see that there are differences. That's okay. Don't worry about it just yet. All right, so if we're walking through our structure, we need to start setting up the sort of visual extents for these elements. You have to make sure you select the right thing, but this, I need the horizontal spacing and the horizontal spacing, or the trailing, sorry, not the horizontal. I need the trailing space, not the, I had the wrong one. So if you add the wrong one, just do undo. And I'm just going to undo that. Let's try that one more time. We want the, and it's not giving me the leading edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this to our view, and this will let me get both the leading and the trailing. I'll add those constraints, and then we should be good to go. Now, if we're looking at this, you might see issues with your views, and I don't see the issue right now because I've actually enabled it, but images don't default to scale to fill, they default to center. And so what we'll see is that this visual extent isn't going to match what we expect. If I change this background color, that should make it a little bit more visible. It's a little hard to see right now. And let's do that. So the graphic is not stretching to fill the whole region in this preview. And so what we can do, we do see it is looking great here, but this is the iPhone 8 and this is the iPhone 6 Plus, or sorry, 8 Plus. And so what we'll need to do is we have to change the content mode to scale to fill. And if we've got stretchable graphics, which I've done in the asset catalog, it will stretch out correctly. Now I can just revert that to our default color, and then we can revert this to our default color as well. So we start to get the overall sense of our app. These are relative positions, so this is going to be based on this. We'll do the center horizontally and the vertical spacing, add those constraints, and just add more constraints here, make sure that we have everything. I think I undid one of these constraints, so I'll center this horizontally again to fix that issue. And we need to do these. Looks like I might have added the wrong one. If you do that, you can just delete something. I sometimes get a little bit dyslexic, and I need to center horizontally. Go ahead and add, make sure that these are, so that should fix that. And as we're looking, the preview should start to look a lot better. We can set up these constraints. We need the leading and the vertical spacing. And this needs to be sort of centered. So I'll just put this in the center just to keep it simple. Now that's going to want to resize it. So that's not actually the right one. So what we need to do is we need to set up our leading edge and our trailing edge to this. And then I want it inset, so I don't want it to make those changes. So this is where, again, we need to use this TIE Fighter button, and we need to tell it to update the constraint constants. That's going to sort of resize it for us based on that position. And it's complaining about the alignment here, so we need to vertically center this, and that will fix that up. And then we just need to do the leading edge here, and then our trailing space here. So if we do all these changes, if I go ahead and run it, we should see something that's looking a lot better. And I don't know if I've gotten everything. I think there's this last one that we need to set up the leading and the trailing. So I'll go ahead and set that up to the view, hit both of those and update the constraints, and we'll run it one more time. And it looks like, okay, I'm missing these labels. So these labels need to be centered. And so this center is going to be actually offset because of my graphic. So it wants to move them, and I do not want to do that. Just add them real quick. Now for these, instead of updating the frames, so if I were to update the frames, that would move them, but now it's visually going to be in the wrong spot because there's this bottom arrow on the graphic. So what I have to do is I have to update these constraints to keep the canvas position. And if we run it one more time, we should see that this is working on the iPhone 8. All right, so that is a little overview of auto layout. We worked on setting up relative layouts, undoing, redoing, centering layouts where you have to add extra views to center the content within the view. So you kind of have this concept of a sub view. So this is our sub view with content inside of it. And so we've got our different regions and all of these constraints that we've added. So now we have all the constraints to make this look good on the iPhone 8 Plus. You can do a little bit of extra work to get it to work on the X and then the SE. It's really important to understand the colors. So when you accidentally move a view, you'll see these orange lines. If you don't have enough constraints, you'll see red lines, and it'll be on horizontal or vertical directions depending on the view. We want to identify structural regions, and typically that's going to go top to bottom in the app first and then left to right. There's going to be probably a lot of horizontal alignments or horizontal pinnings on the sides, and I really recommend starting in one direction. As you're working, it's going to be a little bit difficult because sometimes you won't know if constraints are good or not, and that's something that you'll just have to find out at the very end. So you'll have to see it took a few constraints, not just a few, but like 10 constraints before we had enough rules to describe the vertical spacing between everything, and that's important. So it's not as quick feedback as you might get from writing code of does it work or does it not work, because you have to do a bunch of steps to get to it. The hidden arrow layout panel is one more thing I want to cover. When we have an arrow, there's this little button right here. And if you don't see that, you need to make sure that your document outline is visible. You'll click on this. And here we see a little pop-up. This will give you some more information. And here is a fix. So for this particular issue, if you have a really long view, or sorry, a label here, it could clip content. And so what this is saying is it wants to add a constraint to whatever's to the right of it. So if there's more content here, we don't want to overlap it. And so you need to set up a rule. So if there's a button there, you need to set it up to that. But in this case, there's nothing. So we'll just do the trailing space to safe area. Now, in order to get this to work appropriately, we'll have to select this. And this is another thing. Sometimes constraints move. And what's happening is when I'm clicking on this constraint, it's actually jumping to the very bottom, which makes it really hard to edit. So if I come over to our panel to edit it, I can go in and I can modify it. Now this one, we actually want it to be greater than or equal to 20. 20 is going to be the space to the edge, and that's going to be sort of an inequality. This is going to make it so that if we ever get to the edge with a really long label, that we don't clip the edge. And so that's going to prevent that from happening. And that's how to fix that one issue. So you'll see that that issue goes away and we have fixed it. That's exactly what the fix-it would do. So the fix-it will work. You just have to read over them and understand it. So I think I covered a lot of different things. We talked about changing background colors. The diagonal drag is what I was doing to get some different things. So generally when I drag, I always drag in a diagonal direction because it gives me the most options. If you drag this way, you're going to get context sensitive stuff, which doesn't really help. A lot of times it doesn't have the right constraints that I need when I'm doing my layout. So I always drag diagonally. The shift key really helps with adding multiple constraints all at the same time. And dragging to our document outline allows us to connect our structural regions to the bounds of our screen. So that's really important. And then the image view content mode, which we talked about, this is an image that I have on the screen that is sort of surrounding my text field. So that's it for this auto layout tooltip on just getting started with auto layout. I do have an upcoming course on auto layout. So if any of this was useful, if you learned anything in this, I've got a course that's going to have a lot more information. It's going to cover many of the topics that are in the 30 auto layout best practices guide that I just published. So you can take a look at that as well. That's going to be coming out very shortly. And I look forward to answering any questions that you have regarding iPhone apps or auto layout. Just shoot me an email, paul@supereasyapps.com. And you can check out the blog at blog.supereasyapps.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you have an awesome day.